Well, as I take a sip of my double espresso Americano here, I'd love for you to tell us about stimulants.
Sure, there's no shortage of these in most of our lives. And of course, you can cover the health benefits of it later. Maybe you have an episode.
Yes, we have an episode on caffeine, and it does have certain health benefits, although one has to use caffeine correctly in order to derive those. Yeah.
So caffeine is the easy one to start with, and we won't belabor the point here. The evidence is strong. It has an ergogenic effect. You can take it at whatever dosage is reasonable for you. And of course, there is a bit of a learning curve there, such that obviously the more you take it, the more you need to take, even though there's actually some recent evidence showing even folks who are acclimated to it will still see an ergogenic benefit, even though if they don't feel a big boost of it. So typically that takes 30 to 45 minutes or so, but it's highly dependent upon the person. So some people can smell coffee and immediately feel better, and that's probably working actually through a different mechanism of anticipation, but you can take it there. The half-life of it is 4 to 6 hours or something like that. It can totally depends on the person, so don't let it ruin your sleep. But if you take it prior to performance, it has a noticeable effect on particularly endurance. Maximum strength, maybe less, well, quite clearly less so. In fact, the data are mixed there on whether actually it does anything for peak strength. Although I think most people would suggest that you're going to take it prior to trying to truly lift as high as trying to lift a 1 repetition max or similar. But most of the documented effects are on the endurance-based activities.
Yes, so my read of the literature in terms of performance-enhancing effects of caffeine are that 1 to 3 milligrams, I want to make sure that people hear the units correctly before people blitz themselves out with that caffeine, 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, about 30 minutes prior to exercise, has a definite performance-enhancing effect. It also has a definite mental performance-enhancing effect, especially when people who are regular caffeine users have abstained from caffeine for anywhere from 2 to 15 days. And that's an extremely rare circumstance. But even if they have not, it appears that 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight of caffeine taken about, again, it's not super precise as far as I can see, about 30 minutes before the event starts, can really enhance reaction time and power output, and as well as you mentioned, endurance. When I was researching the caffeine episode, one interesting caveat that I discovered was that if people are not caffeine adapted, they are not regular users of caffeine, the sudden introduction of caffeine can really degrade performance, mostly because people don't know how to operate at that high level of autonomic arousal. Have you ever observed that?
Yeah, 100%. In fact, there's actually data going up as high as 10 milligrams per kilogram of body weight.
Wow.
Which is, in fact, once you cross the 5 milligram per kilogram threshold, you will start seeing performance decrements. So there's absolutely such a thing of ruining your performance with too much caffeine. So most people listening to this, if you're thinking, wow, they said caffeine, I'm all in, and then you just stop listening, and now you go for your quad espresso shot before every time you go to work out, you probably are passing that threshold. If you think about those numbers, 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram body weight. If you weigh 100 kilograms, that's 220 pounds. That'd be something like 200 to 500 milligrams of caffeine, which is like a pretty high amount. But a coffee is going to get you close. An espresso is going to get you somewhat in that ballpark, depending on source and stuff. So you don't really need to go and blister your brain with caffeine. And in fact, if you do, it's quite common, and in fact likely, that you'll actually make performance worse.
Right. Yeah, the amount of caffeine in different coffees and sodas, etc., of course, varies. One thing that people ought to know is that the smallest of commercially available coffees at the most popular commercial vendors generally contain anywhere from 250 to 350 milligrams of caffeine. What that means is that the so-called medium and the large contain as much as 500 milligrams or 1 gram of caffeine. So for you morning large coffee at commercial vendor drinkers, if you're wondering why you get a headache if you're 30 minutes late on that caffeine, or if you can't access that caffeine at all, or even if you're drinking coffee, from another source, you're finding like, oh, it's really not doing it for me. It's because the amount of caffeine in the now commercially sold coffees is exceedingly high. It's about 2 or 3 times higher than the standard lookup tables that you'll see on the internet. So I'm not saying that to demonize caffeine. We can pretty quickly adapt to and form a tolerance to caffeine. Some people never really can get over the jitters. Other people are just fine with even 1,000 milligrams of caffeine, but only because they've been drinking a lot of caffeine consistently.
Yeah,
anyway,
it's also wildly inconsistent from location to location, the brew type, the functionality. So yeah, that stuff can be very hard to figure out what's happening.
there's only one way really to objectively measure caffeine, and that's use caffeine tablets. And they work pretty well. Actually, someone I know who's prominent in the podcast space uses 100 to 200 milligrams of caffeine in tablet form combined with tea.
Yep.
So they've now conditioned themselves to think that herbal tea actually has this caffeinating effect. But tablet form caffeine, while I'm not recommending it to outright, it is going to give you the best sense of how much caffeine you can tolerate and how much is performance enhancing or is performance degrading.
There's actually another line of supplementation that we can go down here, which is not technically a stimulant, but it's something I use to help performance when you don't want caffeine. And so this thing specifically, if you're one of those folks who have to exercise at night and you want a little bit of boost for your training, but you don't want to have caffeine because it messes up your sleep. And this is when you can turn to the whole like citrulline, arginine, nitric oxide sort of route. And we'll skip the explanation there. But effectively what happens is nitric oxide is this wonderful compound that causes vasodilation. And of course, that's going to aid then in transporting nutrients in and out of the cell. So it has an ergogenic effect. You have a number of ways you can go about this. Some of them have more pros and cons than others, and there are more and more data coming out specifically on citrulline more recently. If you look, though, in my opinion, the most consistent evidence for the most consistent effect is in the supplement of beetroot or beetroot juice or extract or something like that. So you can find those supplements, and they tend to, again, they're pretty effective at enhancing performance, specifically anything moderate to longer duration endurance performance, and they are not a stimulant, so they won't ruin your sleep that much.